I was just wondering, in view of the fact that transport accounts for something like 40% of people's emissions, a lot of people would like the choice to be able to cycle or walk, but also people who live in the rural and semi-rural areas. But a lot of people are discouraged because of traffic speeds on rural and semi-rural roads. And that includes Swindon, even though that's quite a tight borough. I mean, for instance, from the outskirts of Swindon, it's only about 3 to 5 miles, so an easily cyclable distance. But people won't do it because it's simply not safe. And that has been admitted by one of the directors of Swindon Borough Council. What can you actually do, all the parties, to prevent traffic speeds from preventing people getting on their bikes? Because a lot of these roads are actually de-restricted, and we're talking about 60 plus miles an hour.
Right, okay, so basically what can you do to encourage cycling, particularly in the rural and semi-rural areas? And I'm going to start with Dave.
One of our local campaigns is called 20 is Plenty. So in the rural areas, 20 miles an hour limits. Sounds great, how do you enforce it? Just the practicalities of how do you actually enforce it? Well, one of the ways you can actually, there are two ways. There's the Bristol way, where you have dedicated cycle routes, which I would like to be able to see here. And then there's the more practical way, and that is by using on-street parking, not necessarily paid for on-street parking, but on-street parking to regulate the speeds, rather than putting speed bumps in, which tends to work rather well. Or you can use the Dutch method, which is to remove all road markings altogether. And then what you'll find is actually the traffic regulates itself, because there are no road markings, and actually it brings the average speeds down and the accidents rates go down as well. Three particularly sort of radical ways of looking at it. As to how you would do it in rural areas, I've got no idea at all. Because how do you police it? Within the towns, I would think that we need to bring the speeds down 20 miles an hour on most of the urban roads. But again, I've got no idea how we will achieve that in Swindon, because it's such an eclectic mix of widths and lengths and bends of roads.
Thank you, Jenny.
Oh gosh, I'm so right. Right, okay. Basically, we have to fundamentally change the way we look at our road systems. You have to give the absolute priority to people that are walking and people that are cycling. Your next priority would go towards public transport, then cars, then heavy goods items, and you're like trying to plane on the road, but that's the fifth one, flying. This can be done through 20 mile an hour speed limits, and we'd actually want to reduce lots of speed limits as well, to bring motorways down to 55 mile an hour and truck roads down to 40, because this does actually encourage people to use more active forms of transportation. We want to ensure that there's at least 10% of all the spending that we do on transport is to encourage walking and cycling, because we think that's fundamentally important. We also want to divert £30 billion from roads buildings to invest in public transport. This would actually reduce your fares for your buses and for your trains by 10%, which we think would make a huge difference. In the longer term, I would love to renationalise the railways and the buses. We're doing it bit by bit. We're doing it bit by bit at the moment. And there is a wonderful cooperative train company that should be set up fairly soon, which will come from Swindon, that I'm really, really positive and really looking forward to. We do have to put investment back in to get people out of their cars. There are obviously going to be sometimes when public transport is not appropriate, and car use will always be there, but we have to make it easier for people to leave their car at home. And there's going to even be things like flexible working and more flexible times for schools as well, as a lot of mothers now work, and they have to drive their children to school, not because it's out of walking distance, but because they have to go on to work afterwards. And maybe we had more working from home and all these kinds of initiatives that, it can be done, and they do it in other countries. And I do remember when our lovely Tory councillor, who I call Councillor Greenwash, but it's what I call him, went to see him on such a great scheme, and unfortunately came back and told everybody in Swindon that it wouldn't work here, which was terrible. But there are things that we can do, and it comes down to prioritising people that are walking and people that are cycling, because that's how we're actually going to get change.
Robin?
My preference would be for cycle paths, because cycles usually go around 15 mile an hour. I find the roads around Swindon not too bad, but most of them don't have limits above 40 mile an hour. Out in the country, I agree with the questioner. There is much more danger there, and I'm not surprised if some people are. The other thing should be dedicated cycle lanes, but yeah, there is a conflict there, and I don't think there's an easy way round it. I personally do sometimes ride on some of these fast roads. I think it does help though if the road is wide.
Okay, thank you. Robert.
Yeah, the question is about rural and semi-rural areas. I'm glad to see that in some parts of Swindon, for example, Wharf Road, the limit's been brought down to 50 miles an hour, which is welcome. However, that is still a fast speed. And you have
50, you're going to die.
Exactly. You would have to put a dedicated cycle route along there. I personally think that what we need to be doing is connecting far more, connecting up what we've got already. We have not got a complete network in Swindon. You know, I'm living in Rawdon. I'd love to be able to cycle directly into Swindon itself. It's very difficult to do that without coming into contact with some very fast traffic. And I'm not a confident cyclist. I feel frightened to do that. And if it's failing that test, then more needs to be done. We've got the bridges over the M4. They've been improved. We've got that great opportunity there to actually have direct and more green routes into town, and I'd love to see that developed. I've also made it clear that my view when it comes to residential areas, whether it's semi-rural or urban, is that 20 is certainly plenty. And that we should be imposing as wide a speed limit as possible, bringing it in with the 20-mile-an-hour bracket. Because the wider you do it, the easier it is going to be policed. And I know in parts of Swindon, and I can see that Jerry at the back of the room who knows a lot about streets for living in the centre of town, great project, expensive. We've got to be realistic and we've got to cut our cloth according to what we've got at the moment. But there are much cheaper and more effective ways of doing all of this, such as, in fact Damon's right about this, such as repainting, breaking up the continuity of roads so they look different, and by, not by zoning, but actually by having a blanket 20-mile-an-hour zone, 20-mile-an-hour limit in residential streets. And I think that's the way we've got to go.
Well, Helen, I think we need leadership. Again, I've said national and local. And during the last government, the Labour government made millions, over £12 million available to create cycle towns. And Bristol is a shining example. It bid for the money, it got it. It's also had Sustrans money, and it is a very exciting, dynamic cycle city. And it has the same problems with the road network as Swindon has, you know, with old Victorian streets which nobody ever envisaged the car, let alone cycleways as well. So it can be done, and I was very sorry that Swindon Borough Council didn't show leadership and didn't bid into that pot. I think that is a great mistake because we could have actually got a very good grid ourselves and a cycle network. I'm a fan of 20-mile-per-hour zones, and what I have really been shocked at in the last year is that the speed in Swindon has gone up. It was a national study that was done. We are one of the fastest towns in the country, and that is not a good thing. That's a bad thing. I opposed, and I still oppose, the removal of the fixed traffic cameras on Queen's Drive and other dual carriageway. I think it sends out the wrong message to everybody. If you're cycling down there, God help you. I know there are cycle tracks down there, but it encourages motorists and lorries and buses, for goodness sake, to travel at such great speeds throughout our town. And it just isn't an effective solution to say we'll have the flashing signs. Because those flashing signs which say 30 miles an hour help those of us who are law-abiding if we've just gone over 30 miles an hour, but they're a great temptation to the teenage road hogs, and I'm afraid the middle-aged road hogs who want to see them go off. So I would like to see more cycleways, more encouragement. I'm delighted that schools like Trego's Primary